His parachute opens automatically. At 10,000 feet, the pilot looks down and sees rolling hills, a lake, a village, what could be American countryside. But he's falling towards the Ural Mountains in Russia. He remembers to take out the map in his pocket and tear it up, scattering the pieces like confetti. Then he takes out what looks like a silver dollar, removes a poisoned suicide pill from inside it, and then decides not to use it. He still has his 9mm pistol. As a CIA pilot, he's been taking surveillance photographs in a U-2 spy plane. It's the go-to aircraft for overflying enemy sites, especially missile development sites in the Soviet Union. Flying at full altitude, 70,000 feet, the CIA thinks the U-2s can't be detected by radar, which is important because an unauthorized incursion into another country's airspace would be considered an act of war. But this U-2 has been spotted and shot down. At 5,000 feet, he can make out power lines, a forest, and as he falls fast towards the earth, a tractor and 2 men. The men rush to help him as he slams to the ground. It's May 1st, 1960. The CIA pilot is Francis Gary Powers.
The United States claims the aircraft was involved in weather research until the Soviets recover the photographs of their military bases a few days later. A furious Khrushchev leaves a planned international summit in Paris before it's even begun. The president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, refuses to apologize for the U-2 spy plane program or stop the overflights. Later on, the pilot, Gary Powers, is interrogated by the KGB and will spend 2 years in a Soviet prison. Parts of his aircraft are placed on public display in Moscow as evidence of American deceit.
But the flights continue, and by 1962, U-2 spy planes are keeping a close watch on Cuba and the surrounding seas. This is The Bomb, with me, Max Kennedy.
And me, Nina Khrushcheva.
Episode 4, Almost Caught.
It's nighttime in July in the Sargasso Sea. Soviet ships are heading towards the Caribbean. Soldiers, drenched in sweat, stand on deck under the tropical night sky, grateful for the chance to breathe in the fresh sea air. Conditions below deck are sweltering and overcrowded. They have been shut in there for 18 hours. They're only allowed up for a short time, always at night, so that they can't be spotted from the air. Soon, they'll have to go back down. The cargo ship, the Omsk, is part of that fleet, heading for Cuba. The ship is designed to carry 61 people, but it carries more than 300 troops and technicians.
It's estimated that each of the soldiers on the ship that carried the missiles, the Omsk, had about 16 square feet of living space per person, which is, barely enough to lie down. They were sleeping in shifts. They couldn't go up on deck. They barely survived this journey. The conditions on the armada of Soviet ships are terrible. The Soviets managed to get 40,000 troops into Cuba by packing them in.
To pass the time and distract them from the cramped conditions, they watch the epic war film called And Quiet Flows the Dawn. It's 5.5 hours long. They watch it on repeat. and in the hold, a threatening cargo. 6 R-12 missiles, medium-range ballistic missiles designed to deliver nuclear warheads. If launched, they could reach targets 2,000 kilometers away.
President Kennedy has been in office for a year and a half. During that time, he and Khrushchev have been writing letters to each other, picking up on the conversations they had in Vienna the previous year. Both express regret about how their meeting in Vienna worked out, where they clashed over control of the divided city of Berlin. Some of their letters are formal and public, but others are marked private or top secret, what National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy would come to call the pen pal correspondence. These are more frank and informal letters between the two most powerful men on the planet, often written during times of heightened tension, and they are delivered through different methods. A Soviet agent with a folded newspaper might meet one of President Kennedy's aides on a street corner or in a bar and slip him one of Khrushchev's letters in an unmarked envelope. Secret or not, their letters are a record of their shifting relationship, friendly gestures, threats, and attempts to manipulate. On July 5th, President Kennedy receives a message from Khrushchev marked secret. It's a new demand for the gradual withdrawal of Western allies from Berlin. Khrushchev says that if there's a further delay in resolving these issues, it would mean a threat to peace. And then he issues his own threat. Kennedy needs to act before it's too late.
He tries to deflect Kennedy's attention away from Cuba by saying he plans to raise Berlin again. So he would rather that the Americans were worrying about Berlin. And, this is a very delicate, dicey game that's being played because Kennedy fully expects something to happen around West Berlin.
For JFK, Berlin is the place where most likely a confrontation with the Soviet Union will take place. That's probably where World War III would start and nuclear war would start. So all attention is on Berlin. JFK doesn't think that the Berlin Wall was really the end of the confrontation, of the crisis, which in fact it was in the eyes of Khrushchev. So saving the socialist project in Germany. The Berlin Wall did that. So he was using the Berlin card to really manipulate Kennedy.
The president writes back to Khrushchev. He calls for a quieting of the Berlin question and talks about their responsibility as the two major nuclear powers, given the destructive potential of the new weapons.
My great-grandfather, Khrushchev, wants to keep Kennedy in the White House. It suits him. And with the president facing midterm congressional elections, the Soviet premier is well aware that Kennedy is under pressure at home.
Khrushchev's planned the way we understand it. He wants Kennedy to have enough support, democratic support in the Congress. He wants to keep the operation in secret because he realized that if it is uncovered, it will make huge damage to his guy in the White House. And the plan was then after the elections to say, okay, fait accompli. What are you going to do about that? You will have to accept that. You will have to swallow this pill.
If Khrushchev can distract American attention towards Berlin, if his missiles and troops can avoid detection by U-2 spy planes, then after the November elections, he will show his hand, the nuclear arsenal on Cuba. It's high risk, trying to hide a military buildup on this scale right under the Americans' nose. But it's a gamble Khrushchev is willing to take. Khrushchev's mission to send missiles to Cuba is huge and messy. Some ships arrive at the wrong port and have to move on to another one.
Many of the soldiers arrive in Cuba sick as soon as they reach dry land. So this was hardly a fighting force that arrived in Cuba. It was a bedraggled army of soldiers that had survived this, incredible journey across the ocean.
The first ships dock on July 26, 1962, which is also Cuban Independence Day. The earliest ones to reach Cuba carry troops and military equipment. The nuclear weapons are still at sea.
The Russians called this Operation Checkered Shirt because before leaving for Cuba, they were all kitted out in the latest Russian consumer items, which turned out to be almost identical checkered shirts, which they all wear together with their baggy trousers. And that's the way they all end up in Cuba.
Once they are on the shore, everything is strange. The climate, the palms, the thought that their homeland is 10,000 kilometers away. The heat and humidity are debilitating. They soon realize that the locations that the Soviet reconnaissance party had looked at in May and said was suitable for setting up a military camp are not suitable at all.
They're brought there, and this is sometimes in the middle of the jungle, sometimes in the mountains. So this is not a terrain in which the Soviet soldiers really ever fought or lived. And very soon they realize that a good part of the personnel has some sort of burns on their skin. They don't know what it is. It turns out that this is a particular type of bushes that somehow don't grow around Moscow or Leningrad, but there is plenty of them in Cuba. So they're hit by some unknown disease.
And still the ships keep coming, loaded with troops and equipment.
How does the United States miss the buildup of nuclear missiles on Cuba? Partly because their attention is on Berlin. Miami is overflowing with Cuban refugees and rumors about the island. A local radio station reports in July that 4,000 Soviet soldiers have landed in Cuba. The noise builds through August.
Something is underway in Cuba. They can't say what it is, but there is increased secrecy. Some columns of troops are moving. It doesn't come from U-2 overflights. It comes from basically people observing what is happening there, and they really can't tell too much.
Tons of intelligence reports are pouring into the CIA from Cuba, but they are not all treated as reliable. And some of them are seen as coming from anti-Castro Cubans who are trying to egg the United States into attacking Cuba, overthrowing Castro, and allowing them to regain power, in some cases, economic assets that had been lost to the revolution.
As the days pass in August, American U-2 planes observe suspicious Soviet ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean, heading towards Cuba. The head of the CIA, John McCone, gathers the intelligence. There has been increased sea traffic to Cuba, and several thousand men seem to have arrived on those ships.
The Americans are thinking in terms of how many American soldiers you could put in the ships. And they multiplied the number of ships by the number of soldiers they thought could be in the ships. And they came up with perhaps 7,000 or 8,000 soldiers. But in fact, the Soviets managed to get 40,000 troops into Cuba by packing them in.
No one at the CIA considers that thousands of men could be locked in the hold of a cargo ship for an entire crossing from Sevastopol to Cuba.
This buildup starts getting noticed by the Americans. Kennedy is concerned. He is being told about it.
On August 22nd, McCone briefs President Kennedy for the first time in person. Ships are being unloaded in Cuban ports where local people have been stopped from entering. The kind of crates coming out suggest airplane parts and radar equipment inside. The president is disturbed by the news. McCone confides in Robert Kennedy that he thinks the developments in Cuba are, quote, our most serious problem. But inexplicably, the very next day, McCone goes on a honeymoon to the south of France. He'll get daily briefings while he's there and send anxious messages to Washington. But without his presence, they don't make an impact.
At the end of August, as the spy planes watch over Cuba, Khrushchev is receiving visitors at his mansion in Pitsunda in Crimea. Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, and Che Guevara. The Cubans want him to sign a public defense treaty with Havana to let the world know what's going on.
They believe by that time that they actually are performing now service to the entire communist community, to the socialist camp.
But Khrushchev refuses to do the public defense treaty at the time. Is it because he was waiting for the elections and then do it later?
Well, he doesn't want and is very concerned about what in today is called escalation. He doesn't look forward to the confrontation with the United States. And he does quite adventurous things with moving missiles, but he believes that he will keep that in secret for a long period of time. So by doing that, he still tries to be careful not to provoke the Americans.
Khrushchev refuses to make the operation public. He is being unusually cordial with Kennedy. He responds positively to a letter from him proposing banning nuclear tests in the atmosphere. Anything to draw attention away from Cuba.
In Geneva this morning, the Soviet representative proposed that agreement should be reached on a cutoff time for all nuclear weapon tests, and that this date should be set as of January 1st, 1963. I'm happy to say that the United States government regards this as a reasonable target date.
It's August 29th, 1962. President Kennedy holds a news conference.
The world will welcome an agreement that a way should be found to stop all nuclear testing at the end of this year.
He announces that they're nearing agreement with the Soviet Union to ban atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. But the journalists want to know about something else.
Senator Capehart of Indiana, in a speech the other day, said that the communists are sending troops into Cuba, not technicians, as you told us last week. Would you comment, sir?
We have no evidence of troops. And I must say that the United States has obligations all around the world, including West Berlin and other areas which are very sensitive. And therefore, I think that in considering what appropriate action we should take, we have to consider the totality of our obligations. We do not have information that troops have come into Cuba. However, we are continuing to watch what happens in Cuba with the closest attention.
The questions keep coming.
Anti-aircraft missiles shipped into Cuba?
We have no information as yet. That doesn't mean that they haven't been, but all I'm saying is we have no such information as yet.
That same day, a high-flying U-2 spy plane over Cuba picks up something important. Its cameras reveal Soviet-made surface-to-air missiles. These can shoot down airplanes, including U-2 surveillance flights.
Soviet missiles have been detected in Cuba, but only the SAM missiles, the surface-to-air missiles.
The U-2 photos show patterns of 6 launch pads, all connected by rough roads in a hexagonal shape, with a command cabin at the center. The spy planes have spotted 8 such sites across the island, but there might be more. Cloud cover stops them from being able to see everything. The surface-to-air missiles can't reach the United States, but the president knows that they can shoot down a U-2, and if an American pilot is killed, the United States could be pulled into war.
That explains all those rumors that were out there. But it is anti-aircraft equipment and missiles, right? So they're not danger for the United States. They're danger for U-2 overflights and American surveillance activities. Only the head of the CIA makes this supposition that the missiles there actually to protect something.
John McCone believes that the only reason the Soviets would put SAM missiles in Cuba would be to protect against overflights that could see something important like nuclear missiles being constructed.
the president decides to draw a red line. There are limits to what he can accept regarding the Soviet buildup in Cuba. He knows they are sending technicians, but not combat troops. He knows they are sending missiles, but not the kind that can strike the United States. And he warns Khrushchev clearly and specifically on that point. He says, were it to be otherwise, the gravest issues would arise. The United States will not tolerate Soviet ground-to-ground missiles in Cuba. He calls a meeting with congressional leaders and asks for consent to call up 150,000 military reservists to deal with the Soviet threat in Cuba.
For Congress, this is a message of assurance, reassurance. We will not allow the Soviet Union to take advantage of us. And to the Soviets, the idea is, okay, we see, we know, don't try to provoke us.
The statement concludes with a promise. The Castro regime will be prevented by whatever means necessary from taking action against any part of the Western Hemisphere. President Kennedy will come to regret that bellicose language.
Khrushchev is on holiday in his Pitsunda mansion on the Black Sea. Here, he is told that the Americans have discovered the surface-to-air missiles. He's rattled.
He is caught, or almost caught. He thinks that something radical and drastic has to be done.
If President Kennedy's statement is meant to warn Khrushchev to stop what he's doing, it has the opposite effect. Khrushchev's reaction is to move faster and send more missiles before everything is uncovered. He thinks an American invasion of Cuba looks almost imminent. So before the Americans discover what he's up to, he decides to complete his secret game quickly. He adds more nuclear weapons to his list. IL-28 bombers to carry nuclear weapons and short-range lunar rockets with nuclear warheads. These are tactical nuclear weapons to be used in the battlefield. They are not a deterrent.
At this crucial moment, the CIA chief, John McCone, astonishingly, remains on his honeymoon, sending cables to Washington from the French Riviera. McCone is convinced that the anti-aircraft missiles are there to protect something bigger, potentially nuclear missiles. But his deputies don't share his concerns, or they don't have enough clout to bring the concerns to decision makers.
The CIA director, McCone, suspects that the Russians are going to put offensive weapons into Cuba, and Bobby Kennedy shares this suspicion. So Bobby Kennedy is already worried about this and already wants to do something about it. But in another part of the U.S. government, at the State Department, there's a fear that if we're too provocative with these spy planes, it's going to derail diplomacy. And to lessen tensions, the United States briefly agreed not to send U-2 spy planes over Cuba.
Gary Powers, the CIA pilot whose plane was shot down over Russia in 1960, has returned home to the United States by September 1962. He's released from a Soviet prison a few months earlier, but the fallout from that incident is still being felt. The fear of provocation means that on September 10th, just as the missile shipments are approaching port in Cuba, Secretary of State Dean Rusk cancels all U-2 flights over Cuba. My father, Robert Kennedy, does not agree with Rusk's decision.
RFK basically gets outvoted, but it means that there are no more U-2s flying overhead at a crucial moment, because that's just when the Russians are putting these missiles into Cuba.
When they decide to continue the overflights, cloud cover prevents further missions. So for almost all of that key month, the Soviets are able to continue to unload their weapons without American surveillance from the skies. The weather, the fear of provocation, the CIA chief's honeymoon, all of these mean the buildup of weapons continues unseen, and the Americans will have to wait for proof of what Khrushchev is hiding in Cuba.